The year was 1878, a time when the land still held its breath, caught between the memory of what was and the relentless push of what would be. In a small, secluded valley cupped by ancient wooded hills that bled into the Blue Ridge Mountains, Kiiya, a woman of the Cherokee people, moved with the quiet grace of a forest creature. The cabin, nestled near a singing creek, was a relic of her parents, a place of sorrow and sanctuary. Grief was a familiar companion, a shadow that stretched long in the morning light and clung to her in the quiet of the evenings. Her people were scattered, their ancestral lands fractured, their spirit, though resilient, bore the fresh wounds of broken treaties and forced marches, of promises that turned to ash in the mouths of those who made them. Kiiya's existence was one of deliberate solitude, a life pared down to essentials. The world outside her valley was a place of discord, of encroaching settlements and the simmering resentment of displaced tribes. She had lost too much to its indiscriminate hunger. Her parents to the coughing sickness that had swept through their village after the last forced move. Her younger sister to a fever that burned too bright and too fast. Her two older brothers, Ahanu and Kuruk, were all the blood family she had left, but they were driven by a different fire, a burning need for vengeance against the tide of settlers, and more specifically, against one man who had come to embody all their losses. They roamed the territories, their hearts hardened by grief and fury, their oath a living thing that guided their steps. Kiiya understood their pain, for it mirrored her own, yet her path had diverged. She sought solace in the earth, in the rhythms of the seasons, in the ancient knowledge of healing herbs, and the quiet language of the wild. Her days followed a pattern dictated by sun and necessity. She tended her small garden, checked her snares, gathered herbs from the forest floor, her hands skilled in discerning the healing from the harmful. The cabin, though solitary, was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of stories, the scent of wood smoke and drying plants, and the quiet dignity of survival. She was capable, her spirit unbent, but a deep weariness resided within her, a longing for a peace that seemed as distant as the stars. Her stasis was one of resilience, yes, but also of a profound loneliness, a life lived on the periphery, watching the world change from the shelter of her isolated haven. Her heart guarded against further sorrow. One late afternoon, as a bruised sky threatened rain, Kiiya was returning from the deeper woods, a basket of late-season berries and medicinal roots on her arm. A sound, faint and unnatural, snagged her attention, a low groan, almost lost in the rising wind that rustled the oak leaves. It was not the call of any animal she knew. Caution, a lesson learned early and hard, made her pause. She set down her basket, her senses alert, every nerve ending alive to the subtle shifts in the forest. Moving with a silence honed over years, she tracked the sound to a dense thicket of rhododendron near the creek bank, not far from the path that led, eventually, towards the nearest white settlement, a place she avoided. Parting the slick, dark leaves, she saw him. A white man, sprawled face down, one arm twisted at an unnatural angle, the earth beneath him stained a dark, ominous crimson. His clothes were torn, caked with mud and blood. He was large, powerfully built, but now utterly broken. He groaned again, a sound of pure agony, and tried to push himself up, only to collapse. He was a settler, that much was clear from his attire and features, one of the very people whose presence in these lands was a source of such deep pain for her and hers. Her first instinct was to withdraw, to leave him to whatever fate had brought him to this pass. It was not her concern. The woods were full of dangers, and men often brought their own violence with them. But as she watched, a shudder ran through his body, a primal tremor of life fighting against encroaching darkness. His vulnerability was stark, absolute. He was far from any help, and the storm was gathering speed, the air growing cold. Another groan, weaker this time, and then silence. Kiiya remained hidden, her heart a conflicted drum against her ribs. He represented the encroachment, the loss, the threat, yet before her lay not an ideology, but a dying man. The traditions of her people, the deep-seated respect for life, warred with the bitterness of her experiences. To leave him would be to surrender to the very harshness she decried in others. The responsibility, unsought and unwelcome, settled upon her. With a sigh that carried the weight of her ancestors' sorrows and her own, she stepped out from the cover of the rhododendrons. The man, Arthur Prescott as he was known in other places, was barely conscious. His face, when Kiiya gently turned him, was pale beneath the grime and blood, his lips tinged with blue. A ragged gash on his temple oozed blood, and his breathing was shallow, labored. His left leg was clearly broken, the bone having torn through the fabric of his trousers and, horrifyingly, the skin itself. But it was the dark, spreading stain on his side that looked most immediately fatal. He had been shot, and perhaps clubbed or beaten as well. She knew little of his kind, except for the tales of hardship they brought, yet the sight of such grievous injury stirred something within her, an ancient instinct to mend, to alleviate suffering. It was a purely human response, cutting through layers of learned distrust. Getting him back to her cabin was an ordeal. He was a dead weight, taller and heavier than she. Rain began to fall, cold and insistent, plastering her hair to her face and turning the forest floor slick. She half dragged, half carried him, her muscles straining, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Each step was a battle against his inertness, the sucking mud, and her own exhaustion. The storm broke fully as she finally hauled him over the threshold of her small cabin, thunder rattling the wooden shutters. He was a disruptive force, shattering the fragile peace of her sanctuary, bringing the scent of violence and the outside world into her carefully guarded space. Inside, she laid him on her own pallet of furs near the hearth, the only soft place in the small dwelling. His presence felt enormous, overwhelming. For a long moment, Kiiya simply stood, rain dripping from her buckskin dress, looking down at the unconscious settler. Suspicion was a cold knot in her stomach. Who was he? What had brought him to such a state? Was he a danger even in his helplessness? Men like him had brought nothing but sorrow to her people. Yet her hands, as if possessing a will of their own, began the work of healing. She cut away his blood-soaked shirt with her sharpest knife, her touch surprisingly gentle. The bullet wound in his side was ugly, puckered, and inflamed. With water heated over the fire, she carefully cleaned it, her movements economical and precise. He flinched and moaned, even in his stupor, but did not wake. She applied a poultice of yarrow to staunch the bleeding, and another of chewed plantain to draw out the corruption, herbs her grandmother had taught her to use. His broken leg was a more daunting challenge. She had set broken bones in animals, but never a man's. With strips of stout hickory bark and lengths of deer hide, she fashioned a crude but effective splint, binding it tightly after doing her best to align the fractured bone. The pain of it, even unconscious, must have been excruciating, for he cried out, a raw, animal sound that tore at the quiet of the cabin. For the first few days, their communication was non-existent. Arthur drifted in and out of a fevered delirium. He would mutter strange words, sometimes cry out, his hands clenching at the furs. Kiiya sat by him, wiping his brow with cool cloths, forcing sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips to fight the fever, and changing his dressings. She observed him constantly, her gaze watchful. His face, in repose, looked younger than she had first thought, lines of hardship etched around his eyes and mouth, but not the cruelty she might have expected. His hands were calloused, a worker's hands. There was a vulnerability in his unconscious state that disarmed her more than any conscious plea could have. When the fever finally broke, he woke with clear eyes, though they were filled with confusion and fear. He stared up at the unfamiliar roof beams, then at Kiiya, who sat across the small room, grinding herbs with a stone pestle. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry croak. He struggled to sit up, a sharp intake of breath betraying the agony that simple movement caused. "Be still," Kiiya said, her voice low and calm. It was the first time he had consciously heard it. "You are badly wounded." He looked at his splinted leg, at the bandages on his side, his brow furrowed. He didn't understand her words, but her tone conveyed a meaning. He was Cherokee or something like it. An Indian woman. Why was she helping him? His memory was a fog, filled with flashes of pain, of running, of a brutal confrontation. The atmosphere in the cabin remained one of uneasy truce. Kiiya continued her ministrations, providing him with broth, then more solid food as he regained some strength. She spoke little, and he, wary and weak, spoke not at all, unsure of her language or her intentions. His eyes followed her as she moved about the cabin, a mixture of gratitude, apprehension, and a dawning curiosity in their depths. He saw the efficiency of her movements, the quiet competence with which she managed her solitary life. He noted the way she paused before stepping outside, listening, always listening. He saw the sorrow that sometimes shadowed her dark eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. Practical interactions formed the entirety of their early relationship. She would help him shift his position, tend to his wounds with an impersonal touch that nonetheless felt profoundly kind. He would watch, learning the rhythm of her days. The silence between them was thick, not entirely uncomfortable, but filled with unspoken questions and the vast gulf of their different worlds. He knew he owed her his life, a debt so profound he had no words for it, even if he could speak them to her. She, in turn, found herself less guarded than she expected. There was a quietness about him, a lack of the aggression she associated with men of his kind. Perhaps it was merely his weakness, but she sensed something more, a weariness that mirrored her own. As days bled into a week, then two, Arthur began to mend, albeit slowly. The wound in his side, though still painful, showed signs of healing without festering, a testament to Kiiya's diligent care. His leg throbbed constantly, but the fever was gone. He started to regain some of his strength, enough to sit propped against the wall for short periods. With this came a hesitant attempt at communication. He would point, use gestures. She would respond with a nod, a shake of her head, or a single, carefully chosen word in her language, sometimes followed by its English equivalent, if she knew it and judged it safe. One afternoon, Kiiya was outside, splitting firewood. It was a task that required strength, and she wielded the axe with practiced skill. Arthur watched her from the doorway, leaning heavily on a crutch she had fashioned for him. He saw the strain in her shoulders, the effort it took. When she paused to wipe her brow, he gestured towards the woodpile, then to himself, a questioning look on his face. He wanted to help, to contribute in some small way. Kiiya looked at him, surprised. His leg was still badly injured. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You rest." But he was insistent, hobbling out and picking up a smaller log, seating himself awkwardly on a stump, and beginning to strip bark with his belt knife. It was a small task, almost symbolic, but it was the first act of shared labor between them. She watched him for a moment, then resumed her own work. They worked in companionable silence, the sounds of her axe and his knife, a quiet rhythm against the backdrop of the forest. Later, as they shared a simple meal of stewed rabbit and roots, he spoke, his voice still raspy from disuse. "Thank you," he said, looking directly at her. He tapped his chest. "Arthur." Kiiya met his gaze. She hesitated for a long moment, the name feeling foreign and significant on her tongue. "Kiiya," she replied softly. It was a small exchange, but it felt like a bridge being built, stone by careful stone, across the chasm of their differences. He began to speak more, short sentences in English, telling her small, inconsequential things about the weather, or a bird he'd seen. She would listen, sometimes offering a word or two in reply. She learned he was a farmer, or had been. He didn't speak of how he came to be wounded, and she did not ask. That subject lay like a sleeping wolf between them, too dangerous to rouse. She found herself observing the way light caught the strands of gold in his brown hair, the way his brow furrowed in concentration when he tried to understand her. He in turn noticed the quiet strength in her hands, the intelligence in her dark, expressive eyes, the way she seemed a part of the landscape itself, as natural and resilient as the ancient trees. Empathy, unbidden, began to bud. She saw not just settler, but a man who suffered, who showed gratitude, who possessed a quiet dignity despite his predicament. He saw not just Indian, but a woman of deep kindness and quiet sorrow, who had saved his life without question. One evening, a chill had crept into the air, and Kiiya built up the fire. Arthur shivered, despite the furs. She noticed and, without a word, draped an extra blanket, one woven with intricate patterns by her mother, over his shoulders. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a raw emotion that made her heart ache. He reached out, his hand hesitantly touching hers where it rested on the blanket. It was a brief, light contact, but it sent a tremor through her. It was a touch not of demand or threat, but of simple human connection. She pulled her hand away, not unkindly, and turned back to her tasks, but the moment lingered in the air, charged and significant. The emotional distance between them was shrinking, discernibly. A few days later, A hunting party from a neighboring Cherokee band, men Kiiya knew slightly, passed through the valley. They stopped at her cabin for water and news, as was custom. Kiiya's heart hammered in her chest. Arthur was inside, asleep, or so she hoped. She met them outside, her demeanor calm, offering them water and dried meat. "Have you seen strangers in these woods, Kiiya?" One of them, a stern-faced man named Galilahi, asked. "White men? 2 of our young hunters were set upon near the Blackwater Fork. One is dead, the other barely alive. They say it was 3 men, led by one with hair the color of dying leaves, a big man." Kiiya felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Hair the color of dying leaves. Arthur's hair in the firelight often looked reddish-brown. A big man. He was that too. She kept her face impassive. "I have seen no one. This valley is quiet." "There is talk," another man said, his eyes narrowed, "that your brothers Ahanu and Kuruk are hunting a particular man. A man who led an attack on a trading party last spring, where many goods meant for our people were stolen, and good men were killed. They say this man has a fresh scar above his left eye." Kiiya's blood ran cold. Arthur had such a scar, a thin white line, almost hidden by his eyebrow, from an old injury. He had gestured once, something about a falling branch. But her brothers, they wouldn't know that. They sought a man responsible for recent atrocities. Was it possible? The details were vague, distorted by rumor and rage. After the hunters left, Kiiya leaned against the rough logs of her cabin, her legs weak. She went inside. Arthur was awake, watching her, his expression questioning. He had heard the voices, the strange language. She looked at him, truly looked at him, searching his face for a sign, a flicker of the cruelty the hunters described, the kind of man her brothers hunted. She saw only the lines of pain, the weariness, the quiet gratitude that had become familiar. Her brothers, Ahanu and Kuruk. Their grief was a raw, gaping wound. Their father's brother had been among those killed in that trading party ambush. They had sworn an oath on sacred ground to find the leader of the attackers and avenge their uncle, their people. Their letters, delivered infrequently by passing kinsmen, spoke of little else. They described the man they sought, tall, strong, with distinctive lighter hair, known for his ruthlessness in raids. The description, chillingly, fit Arthur in a general way, especially if one were looking to confirm a suspicion. But the specific scar mentioned by the hunters, that was troubling. The weight of this new, terrible possibility pressed down on Kiiya. If Arthur was indeed the man her brothers hunted, she was harboring their sworn enemy. The man who had caused such profound grief to her own kin. The thought was a betrayal that sickened her. Yet the man she had come to know, the quiet, grateful patient, seemed incapable of such brutality. Could he be a different man? Or was she blinded by the intimacy of care, by the human connection they had forged in this small cabin? The days that followed were fraught with an almost unbearable tension for Kiiya. She continued to care for Arthur, but a new guardedness crept into her manner. She watched him more closely, torn between the nascent trust she had begun to feel and the horrifying suspicion that now plagued her. He sensed the change in her, the troubled look in her eyes, the way she sometimes flinched from his gaze. He didn't understand its source, and it pained him. One afternoon, as she changed the dressing on his side, her touch was less steady than usual. He caught her hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his weakness. "Kiiya, what is wrong?" he asked, his English still halting but clear. She pulled her hand free, turning away. She could not voice her fears, could not accuse him, and what if she was wrong? What if he was just another unfortunate soul caught in the brutal calculus of the frontier? The knowledge that her brothers could appear at any time was a constant torment. They often used this valley as a passage. If they found him here, she imagined their shock, their fury, their sense of betrayal. They would see her actions as treason to her own blood, her own people. And Arthur, they would show him no mercy. The oath they had taken was sacred, inviolable. The stakes had escalated dramatically. It was no longer just about her and this wounded stranger. It was about loyalty, justice, and the terrible choices that war and hatred forced upon people. Arthur, oblivious to the specific nature of the storm gathering around them, felt the change in the atmosphere. He saw Kiiya grow more restless, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line, her silences deeper, more troubled. He knew with a growing certainty that his presence was endangering her. He needed to leave, for her sake as much as his own, but his leg was still too weak for travel. One morning, Kiiya returned from checking her snares, her face pale, her movements urgent. "You must hide," she said, her voice low and strained. "Quickly." "What is it?" Arthur asked, struggling to sit up. "My brothers," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw signs. They are near. They are hunting a man." She paused, her gaze locking with his, full of an agonizing uncertainty. "A man, they believe, caused great harm." She didn't say more, didn't accuse him directly of being that man, but the implication hung heavy in the air. He saw the terror in her eyes, and a different kind of fear, cold and sharp, pierced through him. Not just for himself, but for her. He understood then that her brothers were not just passing through. They were a threat, a serious one. "Where?" he asked, reaching for his crutch. There was a small root cellar concealed beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of the cabin, used for storing vegetables in winter. It was cramped, dark, and damp, but it was the only place. "Here, quickly, and be silent, no matter what you hear." She helped him move the heavy puncheon, revealing the dark opening. He lowered himself in with difficulty, the pain in his leg making him gasp. Kiiya replaced the floorboard, scattering some furs and a basket over it to further conceal its lines. She had barely straightened up, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird, when the door creaked open. Ahanu and Kuruk stood framed in the doorway, tall and formidable, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the interior of the cabin. They carried rifles, and their expressions were those of men long on a hard trail, fueled by a singular, burning purpose. "Sister," Ahanu said, his voice deeper, rougher than Kiiya remembered. There was no warmth in it, only a weary intensity. Kuruk remained silent, his gaze sweeping every corner, lingering on the pallet of furs where Arthur had lain. "Brothers," Kiiya replied, schooling her features into an expression of surprise, though her heart felt as if it would burst. "I did not expect you." She moved to offer them water, her hands trembling slightly. "You look tired. Sit, rest." "We cannot rest long," Kuruk said, his voice flat. "We are tracking a man, a white devil who has spilled our people's blood. We have word he came this way, wounded perhaps." His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, fixed on hers. "Have you seen such a man, Kiiya?" Beneath the floorboards, Arthur pressed himself against the cold earth, every muscle tensed. He could hear their voices, deep and resonant, the language unfamiliar but the tone unmistakably menacing. He understood. They were hunting him, and Kiiya was protecting him. The realization of her sacrifice, the immense risk she was taking, struck him with the force of a physical blow. Kiiya met Kuruk's gaze, her own steady despite the terror coiling in her belly. This was the moment, the culmination of all her fears, her conflicted loyalties. She thought of the man in the cellar, not the abstract enemy her brothers described, but Arthur, the man whose wounds she had tended, whose quiet gratitude had touched her, whose life now rested entirely in her hands. She thought of her brother's pain, their justified anger. But she also thought of the cycle of violence, the unending retribution that consumed everything in its path. "I have seen no white man, wounded or otherwise, for many weeks," Kiiya said, her voice clear and firm, though it cost her everything. The lie felt like a brand on her soul, a betrayal of her kin. Yet to speak the truth would be to condemn Arthur to certain death, and to make herself a party to it. Only the usual hunters passing through. "The forest has been quiet." Ahanu's eyes narrowed. He walked slowly around the small cabin, his gaze missing nothing, the extra blanket folded on a shelf, the faint, lingering scent of tobacco that was not Kiiya's, the subtle indentations on the earth floor near the hearth that suggested someone had lain there for a long time. "Quiet?" he mused, picking up the crutch Kiiya had hastily leaned in a corner. "What is this for, sister? Have you injured yourself?" Kiiya's breath caught. "A twisted ankle," she improvised, her mind racing. "A few weeks ago. It is better now." She forced a small, dismissive gesture. Kuruk, meanwhile, had stopped directly over the loose floorboard. He tapped it with the butt of his rifle. "This board is newer than the others, or disturbed." Kiiya's blood turned to ice. "I store roots there in winter," she said, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "The old board rotted. I replaced it. Ahanu and Kuruk exchanged a look. They knew their sister. They knew her honesty, her directness. This hesitation, these slightly too quick answers, were unlike her. Suspicion hardened their faces. "We have followed his trail for months, Kiiya," Ahanu said, his voice low and dangerous. "We lost it in the storm near the Blackwater Fork, but other signs led us to believe he sought shelter in this valley. He is the man who led the raid at Talking Rock Creek. He killed our uncle. He must pay." Talking Rock Creek. The name meant nothing to Arthur, hidden below. But Kiiya knew it. It was the site of the ambush her brothers mourned. Her resolve wavered. If this was true, if Arthur was directly responsible for their uncle's death, but she looked at their faces, contorted with grief and a lust for vengeance, and she saw no justice there, only more killing. And what if they were mistaken? What if Arthur was not that man, but another unfortunate caught in the crossfire? The doubt was enough. "There is no one here," Kiiya stated, her voice imbued with a strength she didn't feel. She stood taller, positioning herself subtly between her brothers and the cellar. "You are weary from the trail. Your grief clouds your judgment. If he came this way, he is long gone." Kuruk's hand tightened on his rifle. "Perhaps we should look for ourselves, sister, just to be certain." He took a step towards the floorboard. "No," Kiiya said, her voice dropping, taking on a steely edge that surprised even herself. She met Kuruk's eyes, then Ahanu's. "This is my home, I have told you. There is no one here. If you do not believe me, if you would tear apart my home on a suspicion born of your pain, then you are no longer welcome." It was an ultimatum, a shocking act of defiance against her own blood, her older brothers to whom she owed respect by tradition. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken accusations and wounded pride. Ahanu and Kuruk stared at her, their expressions a mixture of anger, disbelief, and a flicker of something that might have been hurt. They had never seen this Kiiya, this woman who stood against them with such unwavering resolve. Slowly, Ahanu lowered his gaze. He looked around the small, sparse cabin, at his sister's set face. Perhaps it was the unwavering conviction in her eyes, or a reluctance to create an irreparable rift with the last of their close family. Or perhaps, deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. He sighed, a heavy, tired sound. "Very well, Kiiya. We will take your word." He didn't sound convinced, but he also sounded unwilling to force the issue further. "But if we find you have misled us, if this man is found here later," the threat hung unfinished in the air. Kuruk still looked mutinous, but he deferred to his older brother's decision with a curt nod. "We will camp by the river tonight," Ahanu said. "We move on at dawn." He looked at Kiiya one last time, his gaze unreadable. "Be careful, sister. The world is a dangerous place." Then, as suddenly as they had arrived, they were gone. Kiiya stood frozen until the sound of their footsteps faded into the forest. Only then did she allow herself to sag against the doorframe, her body trembling uncontrollably. Tears streamed down her face, tears of fear, of relief, of a profound and aching sorrow for the chasm that had just opened between her and her brothers. She waited a long time, listening for any sound that might indicate their return before she dared to move the floorboard. Arthur, cramped and stiff, emerged slowly, his face etched with concern as he saw her tear-streaked face. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He had heard enough, understood enough. He reached out, and this time she did not pull away as he gently took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "They are gone?" he asked softly. She nodded, unable to speak. "They hunted me," he stated, not a question. "For something I did?" Kiiya finally met his eyes. "They believe you led an attack, that you killed their kinsman, our uncle." Arthur's face paled. He sank onto the edge of the pallet, his head in his hands for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with a deep, weary pain. "I have fought," he said, his voice low. "I have defended myself, my homestead. There was a skirmish at a place called Willow Creek, not Talking Rock. Men tried to burn my cabin, steal my stock. People died on both sides. It was a terrible business." He looked at her beseechingly. "But I never led a raid. I am not a murderer of innocence, Kiiya. I swear to you." She searched his face, his eyes, and she believed him. Or, she chose to believe him. The alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. The man her brothers described, a ruthless killer, did not align with the man she had nursed, the man who showed such quiet gratitude, such gentle concern. Perhaps her brothers, in their grief, had been misinformed, had fixed upon the wrong man. The immediate threat from her brothers had passed. But the air in the cabin was irrevocably changed. A bond, forged in shared vulnerability and her courageous act of protection, now existed between them, undeniable and profound. Arthur knew he owed her not just his life, but his honor, for she had risked everything to shield him. Kiiya, in turn, had made a choice that had redefined her loyalties, aligning herself with this stranger against her own blood. It was a heavy burden, but also, strangely, a liberation. Arthur knew he could not stay. His presence was a constant danger to Kiiya. Her brothers, though they had left, might harbor suspicions. Others might come looking. "I must leave," he said the next morning. His leg was stronger, and with the crutch he could manage short distances. "As soon as I am able." Kiiya nodded, a pang of sorrow mixed with relief. She knew it was necessary. "I will give you provisions," she said, "and show you a safe path west, away from the settlements and the routes my brothers might take." Over the next few days, as Arthur regained more of his mobility, a new kind of quiet settled between them. It was not the silence of suspicion, but of unspoken understanding, of shared experience that transcended words. They spoke more freely now, sharing small stories of their pasts, carefully avoiding the raw wounds of their respective people's conflicts, but finding common ground in simpler human experiences, a love for the land, a memory of a childhood joy, a hope for a peaceful future. He learned of her deep connection to the valley, her knowledge of the plants and animals. She saw in him a yearning for a life of honest work, a weariness of conflict that matched her own. The day of his departure arrived with a gray, overcast sky. Kiiya packed a small bundle for him: dried meat, journey cake, a small pouch of healing herbs. Her heart was heavy. This man who had arrived as an enemy, a burden, had become something else. A friend? More? She did not have a name for the tender ache in her chest. He stood before her, leaning on his crutch, his meager belongings slung over his shoulder. "I have no way to repay you, Kiiya," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For my life. For your courage." "Live well, Arthur Prescott," she said softly. "Live a life of peace. That will be repayment enough." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Perhaps one day," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "when these troubled times are past, perhaps our paths will cross again." It was a fragile hope, almost an impossibility in their fractured world, but Kiiya clung to it. He leaned down, and for a breathtaking moment, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture of profound respect and affection. Then he turned, and without looking back, began his slow, difficult journey west, disappearing into the muted colors of the forest. Kiiya watched him go until he was swallowed by the trees. The cabin felt suddenly, terribly empty. The silence he left behind was different from the solitude she had cultivated before his arrival. It was a silence filled with his absence, with the echo of his voice, the memory of his presence. She had faced down her own kin, lied to them, potentially alienated them forever, all for a man she barely knew, a man who was supposed to be her enemy. Yet she felt no regret, only a deep, resonant sadness and a surprising sense of peace. She had chosen compassion over vengeance, connection over hatred. In the weeks and months that followed, life in the valley returned to its familiar rhythms, but Kiiya was changed. The profound loneliness she had once carried like a shroud had lessened, replaced by a quiet strength, a renewed sense of her own agency. She had looked into the face of conflict and chosen a different path. She did not hear from Arthur again, nor did she expect to. Their encounter was a moment out of time, a brief intersection of two disparate lives, a testament to the unexpected kindness that could bloom even in the harshest of soils. Her brothers did not return that season, and she wondered if they suspected or if they had simply moved on, their quest for vengeance leading them ever further. The rift with them was a source of ongoing sorrow, but she held on to the hope that one day, understanding might bridge it. The meaning of home had subtly shifted for her. It was still her sanctuary, but it was also a place where a profound connection had been forged, where she had discovered a resilience within herself she hadn't known she possessed. She had been tested, and she had not been found wanting. The future remained uncertain, the world beyond her valley still fraught with prejudice and strife. But Kiiya carried within her the quiet conviction that even in the deepest darkness, the light of human understanding, of empathy, could spark, offering a fragile, precious hope. And sometimes she would walk to the edge of the woods, looking west, a silent acknowledgement of a journey shared and a life saved, in the heart of a world that seemed determined to tear itself apart.